At my own company's launch dinner on March 12th, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and thanked everyone for supporting his business. For a second, I honestly thought it was just one of his usual awkward jokes, the kind people laugh at politely and move on from. But then no one corrected him, not even my parents. A few people actually nodded, like they already knew that version of the story. And that's when something in my chest just dropped. I remember looking around the table, waiting for someone to glance at me, to say something like, "You mean her company?" But it didn't happen. The conversation just flowed like he had said something completely normal. He kept going, talking about his vision, his late nights, even mentioning deals that I had personally closed just weeks ago. And the worst part was how confident he sounded, like he'd rehearsed it, like this wasn't a slip-up. This was a narrative he'd been building for a while. I didn't interrupt him, not because I was scared, but because I needed to understand how far this had already gone. My mom even smiled at him at one point and said, "We're so proud of you." And that hit harder than anything he said, because that wasn't confusion, that was belief. I stayed quiet through the rest of dinner, answering questions when people asked me directly, but I noticed something I hadn't before. The way some guests spoke to him first, the way they looked at me like I was just helping out, like I was part of the team, not the one who built the whole thing from scratch. It sounds small, but when you've spent 2 years of your life working late nights, skipping weekends, fixing problems no one else even knew existed, you notice those details immediately.
On the drive home that night, no one brought it up. Not my parents, not even him. It was like nothing unusual had happened, like he hadn't just stood there and taken ownership of something that wasn't his. That silence told me more than any argument could have, because if this was just a misunderstanding, someone would have corrected it by now. But they didn't. And that's when I realized this wasn't something that started at dinner. This had been building quietly behind my back long before I even noticed it. By the time I got home, I wasn't angry the way you'd expect. I was focused, because if people already believed him, then arguing wouldn't fix anything. It would just make me look defensive. And I knew one thing for sure. If he was so confident calling it his company in front of everyone, then he must have thought he could actually run it, too. And that was the first mistake he didn't even realize he had made. The next morning, Sunday, March 13th, I got to the office earlier than usual, around 8:10, mostly because I couldn't stop thinking about what happened the night before. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe it really did come off differently in the moment. But the second I walked in, I knew it wasn't just in my head. One of our junior employees, Samir, saw me and said, "Hey, your brother's already in your cabin." Not our cabin, not even the office. He said your cabin, like I was just visiting. I didn't correct him. I just nodded and walked in quietly. He was sitting at my desk going through emails, not even casually, like he belonged there. When he saw me, he didn't look surprised, just slightly annoyed, like I had interrupted him. He said, "You should have told me about the 11 a.m. call with the Malik group. I had to find it myself." And that was the moment it clicked for me. He wasn't pretending anymore. He had stepped into the role completely. I kept my voice calm and just said, "I didn't think you were handling that." And he shrugged like it was obvious and said, "Well, I am now." That sentence told me everything I needed to know, because people don't just wake up one day and start acting like that. They do it when they've already convinced themselves it's true. Over the next couple of hours, I watched him closely, not in a dramatic way, just quietly observing. He spoke confidently in meetings, but he avoided details, the kind of details that actually keep things running. When a client asked a follow-up question about timelines, he redirected it to one of the team members instead of answering himself. Small things, but consistent. Around noon, I stepped out to grab coffee and I overheard 2 employees talking near the break area. One of them said, I didn't even know she was that involved. I thought it was mostly his thing. And the other one replied, yeah, same. He's always the one in front. That's when it fully settled in. This wasn't about one dinner or one speech. He had been positioning himself like this for months, maybe longer, and I just didn't notice because I was too busy actually building the business. When I got back to my desk, I opened my laptop and started going through old email threads, meeting logs, client histories, not to prove anything to anyone else yet, but to confirm it for myself. And the pattern was clear. I handled strategy, operations, decisions, everything that actually mattered, while he stayed visible, attending meetings, talking to clients, being the face. It was subtle but effective, because people remember who they see, not who's working behind the scenes. By late afternoon, I had a choice to make. I could confront him right there, turn it into an argument, maybe even clear things up for a few people in the moment, but it wouldn't fix the bigger problem because perception doesn't change with one conversation. It changes with proof. And if I rushed it, I'd just end up looking like I was trying to take credit from him instead of the other way around. So instead of reacting, I did something he wasn't expecting. I stepped back. Not completely, not in a way that would damage the company, but just enough to give him space to do exactly what he had been claiming he could do. Because if he really believed it was his company, then sooner or later he'd have to prove it. And I had a feeling he wasn't ready for that part at all. On Monday, March 14th, I walked into the office at the same time as him, but this time I didn't go straight to my cabin. I stayed near the front for a few minutes, just watching how things moved without me stepping in first. He greeted a couple of clients who had come in early, spoke confidently, even offered them coffee like he'd done it 100 times. From the outside, it looked smooth, almost convincing, and I understood why people believed him, because he knew how to look like he was in control. What he didn't notice was everything happening underneath that surface. Around 9:30, he came over and said, "I'll take the lead on most of the calls this week. You can handle back-end stuff." And I just nodded. No argument, no reaction. That threw him off for a second. I could tell he expected pushback, but when it didn't come, he relaxed into it even more. That was exactly what I needed. If I fought him, he'd get defensive, careful, maybe even cautious. But if I stepped back, he'd get comfortable, and comfortable people make mistakes. The first crack showed up the same day. During a call with a mid-level client, he agreed to a delivery timeline that didn't match our current capacity. It wasn't a huge disaster, but it meant the team had to scramble a bit to adjust. Normally, I would have stepped in immediately and corrected it, but this time, I didn't. I let the team handle it, and I watched how he reacted when things didn't go exactly as planned. He got quieter, less certain, started asking more questions after the call ended instead of during it. By Tuesday, the pattern became clearer. He was good at starting conversations, closing with confidence, but the middle, the part where decisions actually matter, that's where he hesitated. A supplier asked him about a pricing adjustment we had discussed weeks ago, something I had already calculated and documented, but he didn't know the numbers. He tried to stall, said he'd get back to them, and after the call, he came to me asking for details. I gave him the information, calmly, no attitude, just enough for him to keep going. Wednesday was when the pressure started building. We had 2 overlapping meetings, one with a new client and one with an existing partner who was already a bit demanding. He chose to handle both, thinking it would prove something, but it stretched him thin. In the second meeting, he missed a small but important detail about a contract clause, and the client picked up on it immediately. It wasn't a collapse, nothing dramatic, but the confidence he had on Monday wasn't there anymore. He started double-checking things, pausing before answering, and people noticed those pauses. By Thursday evening, even the team felt it. No one said anything directly, but you could see it in how they looked at me during meetings, like they were waiting for me to step in, to correct something, to take control again. I didn't rush it. I stayed present, answered when asked, but I didn't lead. And that balance was important because the company wasn't failing, but it wasn't running smoothly either. And the difference between those two things is where the truth starts to show.
Friday morning, March 18th, we had a meeting with one of our biggest clients, the kind that doesn't tolerate uncertainty. He came in early, reviewed notes, tried to prepare, but I could see it in the way he kept going back to the same documents, like he was trying to memorize something instead of understanding it. And for the first time all week, he didn't look confident, he looked unsure. That's when I knew the moment was close, not because things had fallen apart, but because he was about to be put in a situation where confidence alone wouldn't carry him anymore, and this time I wasn't going to step in before it happened. The client meeting started at 11 a.m. on Friday, March 18th, and for the first 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. My brother opened the discussion confidently, introduced updates, and even handled the initial questions without hesitation, but I could already see him relying on general statements instead of specifics. The client, Mr. Khan, was calm but sharp, the type who listens more than he speaks, and that alone usually puts pressure on unprepared answers. When the conversation moved into pricing and delivery timelines, the energy in the room shifted slightly. Mr. Khan asked a simple follow-up question about a clause we had already agreed on 2 weeks earlier, something I had personally revised and documented. My brother paused for a moment longer than usual, flipped through the file twice, and then gave a vague answer that didn't fully match the earlier agreement. The silence after that answer felt heavier than it should have. Mr. Khan didn't react immediately, he just looked at the document again, then back at him, and said, "This isn't what we discussed last time." That was the first real crack in the room.
I stayed quiet until that point, sitting slightly back from the table, observing everything without interfering. My brother tried to recover by explaining the intent behind the change, but it was clear he was improvising rather than confirming facts. A few seconds later, Mr. Khan turned slightly toward me and asked, "Can you clarify this?" Not him, me. That moment alone changed the entire tone of the meeting. I looked at the document, confirmed the original terms calmly, and explained the correction without exaggeration or emotion, just facts. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. It wasn't confusion, it was realization. My brother didn't interrupt, but I could see it in his face. He knew exactly what just happened. The client didn't make it dramatic, he simply said, "We'll proceed based on her confirmation," and moved on. The rest of the meeting ended quickly after that, more like a formality than a discussion. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a quiet shift in who was actually in control of the situation. After the client left, there was a long silence in the room. My brother finally spoke, but not with anger, more like frustration mixed with disbelief. He said, "So you were just waiting for me to mess up?" I looked at him and told him no, I wasn't waiting for him to fail, I was waiting to see if he understood what he was claiming. Because it's easy to stand in front of people and take credit, it's much harder to carry it when details start to matter. He didn't respond after that. He just sat back, looking at the table, realizing for the first time that visibility and responsibility are not the same thing. And I didn't continue the argument, because I didn't need to. The truth wasn't something I had to force anymore. It had already shown itself in front of everyone who mattered. That evening, I didn't celebrate, I didn't confront him again. I just stayed late at the office while everyone else left, because I knew this wasn't really about one meeting or one mistake. It was about what happens next when someone realizes the role they were playing was never theirs to begin with. If this story hit you even a little, subscribe to my channel. I share emotional stories about trust, betrayal, and the truth people usually hide. And the next one is way more relatable to our lives, so don't miss it out by subscribing.